Welcome to Glazed Over,
a podcast for business tips, painting tricks, and gabbing with friends.
We're your hosts, Amy Williams
and Christine Steele, and we're so glad you're here.
Hi, everyone. Bisque Imports is proud to sponsor the CCSA's new podcast series. Why? Because we love new and innovative things. Check out our latest on-trend designs in the new items section, as well as in our digital version of the quarterly booklet on our website. Enjoy the podcast.
Feel like a juggler at your ceramic studio? Between classes, bookings, and admin tasks, those pins keep flying. Let Occasion help you put down the act and get back to creating. Visit occasion.act to discover your peace of mind.
Want more customers to find your Fired Art Studio? As a CCSA member, you'll get a prime spot on our CCSA Studio Locator, a tool designed to help customers discover you. Your studio's contact info and online links will be featured on our website, reaching a lot of potential customers looking for creative experiences just like yours. Whether it's parents planning a pottery party or someone looking for a fun day out, the CCSA Studio Locator helps them find their way to your door. It's a simple but powerful way to boost your visibility and grow your business. Join CCSA today and make sure your studio is on the map. Visit ccsaonline.com for more details.
Hey, Christine.
Hi, Amy.
I'm excited. I'm really excited. Today's episode, we have on the master, Jim Skutt. The king of kilns is what I'm deciding to call you right now. Hi, Jim. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you two?
So good.
This has been a really requested episode. Everyone wants to hear from you. And we did talk a little bit before we pressed record about how, you've given this certain presentation many, many times over the years, but no matter how many times people hear it, they pull something new out of it. And I absolutely agree with that. I could genuinely listen to you talk about kilns all day because you're just so knowledgeable. And we're really excited to kind of have you on here and just give us a general kiln chat, if you will.
Yeah.
So, will you tell us, who you are for the three people at home who don't know you? Will you kind of tell us like who you are, how you got started, what your role is now at Skutt? Because I do believe it's different. And just, get to know you a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. So we got started in 1953 in Olympia, Washington. And it was almost by chance, and I won't go into that story, but my uncle and grandfather started the company and just kind of built one kiln and then built another one and built another one after that. And that was, 71 years ago. It's been pretty fun. My dad ran the company for years and years and years, and then I got involved in 1987 full-time. Now, I grew up down there, I was sweeping floors when I was 8 years old. So it's actually been a fair amount of my life has been spent down there, wallowing around in brick dust and cardboard boxes. But it's been a great run. And starting in 2023, I stepped out of the president CEO role and I guess kind of gave myself a promotion up to the board of directors. And at the time, we didn't really have a fiduciary board of directors. So we've always kind of had an informal maybe group of advisors, but that's about it. And so as I thought about how would I help lead the company many years into the future while I'm starting to slow down just a little bit, I thought, the board of directors, why don't I do that? Why don't I establish a board of directors? And so the last year and a half, 2 years, I've been working on establishing that. We brought in an interim CEO, a guy that had been helping us through COVID with all sorts of manufacturing and supply chain issues. And he's a very skilled manufacturing executive. So he agreed to help us out for 2 years as an interim CEO while I went in and established a board. And then this coming spring, we'll start looking for a full-time CEO. And we're kind of shoring up the management team and really pleased to announce that a lot of our regular players that have been on our team have kind of been promoted into cool management positions. And they're doing a great job running the company day to day. I'm still very involved, but I'm doing less of the day-to-day stuff and more, things like this. They still tap me on the shoulder and
exactly. And we're grateful for that. I just had the privilege of chatting with your technical support last week. I needed to change the relays in my kiln, but we didn't quite realize that was what was happening yet. And it was really cool because we do have the touch screen. We just called up and I forget who we chatted with, and he was able to pull up the full diagnostics report see and he was like, yeah, the top of your kiln's not getting as much heat as it should. It was amazing. That is the best choice I've made for my studio, is to have that touch screen kiln, hands down.
I didn't even know that was an option.
That's
Oh
the
yeah.
realization of the vision that we had, right? Which was, let's get these things giving us just a little bit of data so that we can help you keep firing really high quality stuff really quickly.
Yeah.
So, our
Yeah.
tech support team, we're really proud of those guys and men and women that help us out in that role. And they do a great job. And having data on their side just helps them do the job faster and better. So
Yeah,
it's
it was so impressive. Today, we really just kind of want to chat like kiln tips and tricks, like best practices, maybe asking some kind of specific questions about how many we need in our studio, things like that. Really quickly, just kind of starting us off, can you talk us through about like the different types of kilns and maybe the ones specific for our industry that we really need to pay attention to?
Got it. Yeah, I mean, there's kilns everywhere, right? I mean, you've
Right.
got huge forklift kilns that dry lumber, things like that. But for our purposes, most of the kilns, everything that we do in this market segment in this industry is going to be an electric kiln because they're easier to control, and we don't need any custom atmosphere or anything like that. All of our kilns are just an oxidation atmosphere, which helps develop the colors of the glazes. So it's a pretty straightforward process. The different construction types, we use insulating fire bricks, which are very low density bricks. So they're not like what's in a fireplace. These are almost like pumice. They're really lightweight. You could stick a car key right into it. I mean,
Yeah.
they're lightweight.
Yeah. Or a
But
kiln shelf and
I was gonna
knock
say,
off
or a
half the
shelf.
brick.
Or a
Yeah.
kiln shelf.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
so the bricks are really low density, and that's what gives them their great insulating property.
Hmm.
We can be up to 2,350 degrees inside, and in 3 inches drop it down to 450 degrees, which means the outside of the kiln is as hot as the inside of your oven at home. It's true, but it's still a pretty good delta T if you're looking from an engineering standpoint. That's a pretty good feat, and it's done by just having millions of little air pockets, air bubbles inside that brick. So it's like having thermal pane windows, but zillions of them. And so these little
Yeah.
air pockets,
Oh,
are
cool.
great insulators.
I had no idea.
Yeah, me either.
They put those in there they put sawdust in the slurry. That's how they make the air pockets.
Really?
Put sawdust in there, and then they fire the sawdust out.
See,
They
this is what I'm
neat.
saying. We learn something new every time we
Yes.
chat.
Yeah, it's
I would
pretty
have
Yeah.
never, ever known that.
Yeah. So there's insulating fire bricks, the type of kiln that we make, and then ours are all top loaders so that the lid comes up. But then there are ceramic fiber kiln. Ceramic fiber is another insulating medium that can be used, and it's interesting how they make it, but basically it's a fiber of varying densities, and they can form it into slabs or specific shapes. Sometimes they're cast into cylinders. Generally, why we don't use it is that it's not quite as durable as the brick is, and the brick's pretty soft. So ceramic fiber can be very fragile, and it has some shrinkage issues, and it doesn't necessarily take really high temperatures very well, really high, like, cone 10, 2350. You have to use really expensive fiber to do that. So those are probably the two main types. Then I alluded to it earlier. We make top loading kilns, but there are also front loading kilns. A lot of folks think that they're easier to load, and in many ways they are. If you don't like bending over a kiln to load down the bottom, you're kind of reaching in. But if you're putting a big heavy shelf straight out in front of you, it still kind of torques your back. So
Yeah.
it's a bit of a trade-off, and front loaders tend to be about twice as expensive as a top loader for the same size chamber. They're just a little bit harder to make. You've got to make stuff a little bit sturdier to get that door to hang properly. So I think that's one of the reasons why people stick with the top loader design. It's just cheaper.
Now,
Yeah.
with us talking about entering the shelves and everything, and then the fire brick, they're pretty easy to replace.
The fire brick?
Yeah. How much of a chunk, if it breaks off, how much of a chunk can you like kind of handle, and like what point should you say, oh my goodness, I need to get a new brick in here? Like what is it, like, do you have any recommendations of like, if it's like 75% damage, not that my kiln, don't look at it, but not like my kiln's like that right now, but hypothetically.
Fair enough. No, this is just asking for a friend.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely. Another studio owner
It's a
called
safe
us, right?
space.
I mean, there's a couple different places where I know you guys would never do it, but let's just say somebody were to accidentally bump a shelf into a brick. There are kind of two areas, right? One that's really critical is right where that element groove is. So there's a very thin, kind of fragile piece of brick that supports the element. We just carve out some of the brick to make a groove, and that leaves kind of a thin edge that's exposed. And if you hit that edge with a shelf, it's no contest, game over. That lip of the element groove is going to break out. When I do these talks over at CCSA or Pottery Camp or Garefest, any of these places, I'll talk about if that were to happen, and you can catch it right away, you can insert some pins that are made out of the same material as the heating element and just kind of build a ledge up, build a little picket fence, if you will, to keep the element up in the brick. And it'll last for 10 years. If you do it right, spacing them out every couple of inches or maybe every half inch, 3/4 of an inch. And then that'll keep the element from kind of drooping and oozing out of that slot. It only takes about one firing for that element to start creeping its way out of a gap in the element groove. So that kind of covers that one. Probably the least fortunate place to have a shelf hit the brick. If the element does start to leak out of there, you're probably better off just leaving it. It's really hard to, after the fact, to try to heat those elements up and shove them back into the hole and then pin them in place. It doesn't work very well. And then the other place where you might bump into a brick or have some brick break away might be along the top edge of the kiln. I think that's probably the second most likely area where brick might break away. And people are concerned that they might see a little bit of a gap or, maybe a piece an inch by 2 inches is kind of chipped away from the hot face of the brick. I wouldn't worry about that really at all. I'd just kind of let it go. Where it starts to become an issue is if the lid's down and the kiln's glowing inside and you can look right along the plane of that interface there. If you see a bunch of glowing light, not just a little strip, but if you see a big chunk of, hey, this is orange and there's, it's a half an inch or something like that and an inch wide. And I'd probably think about putting, that might be a good use for ceramic fiber or a little bit of ceramic rope, a gasket material, something like that to kind of fill it. But Christine, you make a good point that the bricks are really easy to replace. The time to do it is when you're replacing elements. And in this market, you can get probably 5 or 6 years of daily firing out of a set of elements. So you don't change them very often, but that's the time to replace brick if you're doing the element change.
And do you replace like full bricks, all the bricks, or just the ones that you need to? Is that a silly question?
Another good question. So everything's designed to just be modular. You can replace maybe just 1 or 2 bricks that are broken out. The majority of our kilns are set up so that each section is only 2 bricks tall, so that let's just say the bottom brick in the bottom section of the kiln is broken. You can unstack the first 2 sections, take that bottom section off, flip it upside down, and now the broken brick's right on top. Then you just loosen the band, take it out, put the new one in, tighten it back up, flip it over, and reassemble the kiln. So it's pretty easy to get to whichever brick is broken. We call them terminal bricks, which are the bricks where the ends of the element go into the red box. Those are tricky to change without changing elements. We've got videos on our website that do brick replacement, element replacement, and I'd probably, direct people to that. If you go under resources and videos, there's lots of stuff in there about how to do this.
Yeah, that's actually where we learned how to replace the relay. It's just my girlfriend and me on Skutt's website being like, okay, oh God, there's a video. Thank God, we didn't know. And they're helpful. They're really helpful.
You can back them up, right? Like that didn't make any sense. I got to watch that again.
Yeah,
exactly.
My boyfriend's a welder and I did the same thing. I actually just shoved the video at him and I said, change the element here. And then I walked away. So I appreciate that because it wasn't even something that I had to. I mean, I knew I could if I watching the video, but I just was able to pass that off to someone. So it's very helpful. I'm
scared about the elements when I have to do. I haven't had to do it yet, but I'm scared, and I know I shouldn't be, but it just feels intimidating.
I always ask people, how many people in the room are electricity makes them kind of squeamish, and hands just shoot up, and we're taught at a young age, don't stick metal things in the outlets, and we don't really understand where electricity comes from. So it's just this magical thing and we're afraid of it. Really, it's pretty interesting stuff, Ohm's law and just the basics of how a circuit goes together. It's fun stuff. So, if you guys want to nerd out, just give me a call sometime.
Yeah, that's above my pay grade, but I'm so glad that you know about that.
Yes. You said that an element should last you from a daily firing up to maybe 5 or 6 years.
We learn a lot from our customers, and from the CCSA Contemporary Studio crowd, we've learned that you can fire them every day for about 5 or 6 years.
Okay.
Of elements. And the symptom in this case is that it very rarely does an element break unless it gets some glaze on it or something like that. Usually what happens is the firing times just start to extend. What used to take 7.5 hours then takes 7 3/4, and then 8, and then 9, and then maybe 10 hours. and you're wondering, what the heck is going on with my kiln? It's just this frog in the frying pan. The poor frog, it's a terrible analogy, but the frog in the frying pan thing where you don't even really notice it over time. And then you just one day wake up and realize, oh man, that used to take 7 hours. Why is it taking 10?
And is that because it's not getting it's taking longer to get to the temperature? That's what's happening. Yeah. They're kind of dying out.
Yeah. So there's kind of two things that go on in a kiln. When we're designing a kiln, first thing we do is look at the chamber size. And then we have some spreadsheets and cool calculations where we can say how much heat or how much wattage do we have to put in that chamber to get it to go to the temperature we want. If you say, hey, I only want to go to 1500 degrees for glass or something like that, we can make a much bigger chamber because we're limited usually by the amount of wattage we can put in, but it's that ratio of chamber size and wattage. So as the wattage from the elements goes down, which is what happens as the elements age, then that max firing temperature would tend to drop, or the firing time just really extends out. So
if it's the same studio owner that was asking before about the bricks, just called and wanted to ask, hypothetically, not me, of course, if you had to replace that element more than once in a year, for example, just hypothetically, would you say that maybe that would be the bricks? Because if they're like drooping down or anything, without me calling tech support for my friend.
Oh, let's see. So having to replace elements really. Oh, yeah. Let me preface all that. I should have said and added in about 1,500 firings at cone 06.
Sure.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Now, if you want to go to stoneware temperatures, cone 6, that number is dramatically reduced. And
that makes
I mean, like an order of magnitude. So now it's 150 firings or something like that. I've always been a huge advocate of stoneware for this industry, for this market segment, for functional wear. Anything that goes in and out of the oven, in and out of the microwave. I love seeing the adoption of stoneware for that.
Yeah.
It's going to sound self-serving here, but this isn't the reason why. It is harder on the kilns, and people kind of need to factor that in, that going to that extra 400 degrees from cone 06 to cone 6 makes a huge difference in the life of the elements and the thermocouple.
You can find on your kiln if it's capable of going to that heat, right? Like every kiln, like on the side of the box, I want to say.
Yeah, on our kilns, we put a nameplate on there that talks about the max temperature, and the standard model for contemporary studios tends to be something like a 1227. So 12 sided and 27 inches deep gives you about a 28 inch opening left to right. And that one, all of those models except one will go to 2,300 degrees. But there is one, the single phase 208 volt model, that is rated just for cone 5. It'll probably make it to cone 6, but we have a pretty conservative way we rate kilns. And if it takes a certain amount of time to get to a temperature, we just kind of stop it and say, okay, that's as high as it can go.
This is me realizing in real time that that's what the numbers of the kiln means, the 1227.
I did the same.
Like I have the,
I didn't know that either.
I have the 1018 and I didn't
So
realize. Yeah. I'm now looking over at it like, huh.
Yeah.
It's 10 sided and 18 inches tall. So it's 4 bricks tall and 10 a ring.
Amazing.
So the number of rings the number of bricks in that ring determine its diameter.
And so the most popular one for our industry is the 1227. I would say that's what I've seen mostly in the studios. And you would agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. We're starting to see some 1222s. We added in the 22-inch line of kilns. So we basically took everything we made and then said, hey, why don't we take one brick out of it so that it's a little bit easier to load. I'm 6 feet tall and I can barely reach the bottom of a 27-inch kiln on one of our regular stands. So if you're shorter than me, it's going to be harder.
So that's actually the kiln that I have one being delivered within the next couple weeks, and it's a 1427.
Fantastic. That's a new
it's
new
a
model.
Skinnier one, right? So that means it's a bit skinnier.
Not the gigantic oval, but it's the next size down. It's a new oval kiln that we're doing. So it's 14-sided. So it's like take a 10-sided kiln and stretch it out a little bit. That's what we do. You widen it and then 7 inches deep.
My manager's going to be mad though, because she already struggles for the bottom. I had to get her a step stool for her to get in there. And so I'm going to have to break the news to her.
Well, it happens. It's sometimes it's tough to give up that volume, and it's always tricky. If you've been in business for a while, you know what size kiln you're going to need. But if you're just starting, it's hard to imagine what size kiln am I going to have. Depending on the volume, the holy grail is to kind of fire a kiln, load it, fire it, cool it, unload it, and reload it in a 24-hour cycle, so that you can kind of get this nice rhythm. And that's not that easy to do. One of the tricks that we learned from you all back in the day was if you add a little fan blowing on the kiln, once the kiln goes to complete, meaning it's reached its maximum temperature, but now it's ready to cool down, that's when you turn the fan on the outside of the kiln. And it's like wind chill for your kiln. It takes some of the heat away from the outside of the kiln, and then the chamber is encouraged to give up heat faster. And it can reduce your cooling time. Let's say the cooling time is 16 hours. It can reduce that by anywhere. We've heard of people that have reduced it by 6 hours. I think that's a stretch.
Wow.
I'm going to say 3 to 4 hours probably on a Kone 06.
It probably could add time if you don't turn it off while it's heating up. Is that a problem then?
Absolutely. Yeah, you do not want to turn that on while it's still heating, or you're just wasting electricity and stretching out the firing time. So it's a trick that's only used on the cool down. Another huge benefit and why we recommend it is that I always get this question, when is it okay to take the PEEP plugs out?
Yes.
And when's it okay to prop the lid open? And I just say it's never okay to do
never.
that.
Yeah.
Okay.
That is actually, everyone just gasped. Everyone that didn't know that just gasped, because that's very popular in our industry, is pull those peeps and crack the lid.
Yeah, and I just want to throw out a cautionary note. Here's my public service announcement on that one. When you pull out more than one peephole plug at a time, you create what we call a jet draft, where you're sucking in cold air through the bottom one and blowing out really hot air through the top one. And it doesn't take much vertical separation between them to get that to happen. We had a case where someone got burned from the hot air coming out because they had two of them undone at the same time. And we never would want that, obviously. So safety first. And so it's very important, even if you want to take a PEEP plug out, always make sure that you take out just one at a time, never more than one. So we don't want that jet draft going on. But beyond that, the reason we like this fan technique is we don't like to see cold air or room temperature air come in contact with any finished ware inside the kiln, because that creates a lot of thermal shock. And if you've ever heard that little Rice Krispie sound, a little snap, crackle, and pop going on inside the kiln, usually it could be from the brick, but often it's from the glaze, that thin glaze layer, that clear glaze. It's that layer breaking or crazing.
Oh, right.
Cooled faster than the clay body below it. And so it has no choice but to shrink and break. And nobody wants crazing on their clear glaze. So use the fan trick instead of letting room temperature air come in contact with your pieces.
Now I have to ask you a hypothetical question for a friend. Now we have you here, so we get to ask you specific questions, and then we'll get broader in a second. When I realized that I needed to change my relays, it's because I got an error message, the error D, I think, and it was held at a really high temperature for a while. And so I came in and unplugged it. And as it came down, I was just working in the studio and could hear the noises that the kiln was making. And I was so scared because I just didn't know what it was. It was like so noisy. It was like that popping, shifting. I'm calling all my people being like, is this okay? And they're like, yeah, it's just the kiln like moving. I don't know. Like what was that?
No, so that's exactly right. I mean, go back to your science class where they taught you about thermal expansion
It's been a while, Jim.
About driving over bridges and stuff where they have those gaps to handle thermal expansion. Okay. So we have to design or our materials have to be such that we're going from room temperature to 2,000 degrees. I mean, that's 1/5 of the temperature of the surface of the sun. It is hot, folks. Okay. Yeah. And we're doing it routinely. So we're going from room temperature to 2,000 degrees and back and forth. And so the bricks and the band and the box, everything in there, the stand, it all expands and then has to come back together again as we cool back down. So it's like your house, it just moans and groans and creaks and does all sorts of stuff.
And I was kind of having the thought that like I'm very rarely in the room with my kiln when it's that hot. Like maybe it is often making those noises. And it's like for me specifically, I'm driving around with my music turned really loud. And so when it's off in the car and you start to hear things, it's like, is my car broken or is this how it always sounds?
Right.
I was just trying to convince myself that like this was normal and this is good.
Yeah, no, it's keep the radio turned on in the studio. You don't want to hear the kiln.
Exactly. That makes me feel better.
Are you spending hours managing studio bookings and class registrations? Occasion helps ceramic studios save an average of 3 days a week in admin time. With clever workflows, instant confirmations, and seamless class management, you can focus on what matters, creating amazing experiences for your customers. Join successful studios like Clay Cafe Avalon, who've trusted Occasion since 2016. Visit occasion.app and schedule a demo today. Mention Glazed Closed Over podcast for personalized setup support.
Hey again, speaking of new and innovative designs, did you know that Bisque Imports maintains a new item pipeline of over 200 designs? The design team at Bisque Imports meets monthly to discuss trends, review product lines, and get amazing new shapes into production. We've recently started providing you with advance notice when new items are on the way from our factory. Check the Arriving Soon category on our website to view brand new shapes that are coming soon, as well as existing shapes that will soon be back in stock. You can even click the Notify Me button on the product page to get an email when these items are received. Enjoy!
I know this is kind of cost, depends on what you can afford and stuff. But if you're a new studio and you are starting out, how many kilns would you recommend to bring in?
Yeah, I think it's probably the best advice is most studios starting up, and I'm sure you guys probably know better than I do on some of this stuff, but depends on square footage and kind of what your target is of how many people you're trying to get in there and how many pieces you might have to turn. But most of the studios we hear about start out with two 1227s. It's a pretty standard, pretty safe buy. And then you can be loading one while one's firing, and you've got the ability to kind of turn the pieces around and get them back to your customers in a timely manner. I know that's important to so many people, that we've got to have enough capacity that once we fill a kiln, we can fire that load and get it off. There's always been a debate, like, should I buy a 1227 and an 818, a little 8-sided one that's 18, just so that I can do a rush job? I think there's some wisdom to that if you only want to buy, or maybe the budget is such that I don't think I'm going to fill up that 1227 that often, but there might be a rush job here or there. Certainly that's an approach you can take. I think the challenge then is you've got two sets of shelves, two different diameters of shelves that you're wrestling with. So most of the people that I've talked to that have done that usually come back and say, I wish I would have just bought the second 1227. And then, like Christine, you're discovering, hey, I need something larger than a 1227. I'm going to go with, I've got enough volume now that I'm going to go with a 1427, just a slightly larger unit. Once you get to that stage, you can make up your own mind. You probably don't need our recommendation, but the intro buy is probably two 1227s.
That's what I have been most familiar with. What about you, Christine? Is that what you see?
Well, actually, that's the reason why I bought one, is because I only have one, and I've only had one for about 5 years now. And I know I was impressed with how long that's held up for me. I looked at my manager and I said, it's time to add another one. Like it was too much. Like there's no way. And I also was really worried because thinking about that wear and tear on that one kiln, I didn't know if I was damaging it because I was making it and forcing it to cool down a little bit faster to, do the stoneware, do the bisque fire, do all that kind of stuff all at like different times. And I was nervous. So I was like, let's just get another one. Because the other thing is, I think you should always have two, even if one doesn't, if it's like you got something from a marketplace, because if something breaks, you're in trouble, like your business literally, because it takes about 3 or 4 weeks sometimes for you to get a kiln. You have to be careful. So that was the fear.
It's really true. I mean, it's like having a spare tire, right? I mean,
totally.
You don't want to drive your car without a spare tire in there, because what happens when you need 4, you can't get by with 3. I know everybody's drawn to the beautiful pieces like you all make, but at the end of the day, you got to have a kiln to fire it. Otherwise, you don't have anything.
Yeah, what's the point?
It isn't real attractive, and it isn't real sexy to talk about keeping your kiln in tip-top shape, but it's pretty important.
Yeah.
People are always asking, like, what are the main things that fail? And Amy, you've mentioned relays. The relays and thermocouples. So the relays are the little switches that take a signal from the temperature controller and they turn the elements on and off. And that's just kind of how it controls the temperature and increases it over the course of the firing and keeps it from going too fast. Like if we just turned it all on, it would go too fast. And then the thermocouple is the temperature sensor. That's the little probe that goes inside the chamber that gives feedback to the controller so it knows when to turn the elements on and off. And both of those things are considered wear items. We just mentioned tires, unrelated, but relays think of relays as kind of like the tires on your car. You're not going to have to change them that often, but you're going to have to change them every now and then. Thermocouples are maybe more like an oil change, about $20. And it's important to keep that thing in tip-top shape. And if you, heaven forbid, happen to hit it with a shelf when you're loading the kiln, you'd be better off straightening it back out, taking it out of the kiln, putting a new one in, and then firing, because an old oxidized thermocouple, if you bend it, it can decalibrate it. And now if you just straighten it back out and fire it, you have no idea how that kiln's going to fire it. If it's at the end of its life, it's a really good bet that you're going to overfire that load to some extent. And you would not want to do that at Christmas time, for example. So make sure that your staff knows, hey, if we bend one of these things, what do we do? don't shame them into,
Exactly.
burying it or sweeping it under the rug. You want to have them stop and say, it's okay. It's a $20 thing. Let's not worry about it. Let's swap it out. And you keep that old one and just wait until you have a chance to test it.
How do you test it?
You'd want to
Witness
do,
cones?
yeah, just witness cone. Exactly. Just put a cone on a shelf right below it and fire to make sure it's giving you what you expect to see.
What does it mean when the thermocouples start spitting the black stuff?
Yeah, that's pretty normal. What happens is that the thermocouple is made out of material that's not that different from element wire. It's a little bit different, but it conducts electricity better, but it holds up to temperature the same way. But the element wire actually creates a little aluminum oxide coating on it, so it doesn't spall. And there's not enough aluminum in the base metal of the thermocouple to do that. The nuances are, I'm not your guy, I'm not your materials guy, but so what's happening is it's just the thermocouple is oxidizing and one side of it oxidizes more than the other. And one of the tricks you can do is just take an index card and a 3x5 card and an old toothbrush. And before you start loading the kiln, just go in there, hold the index card underneath it and hit it with the toothbrush real quick. And that'll take anything that's just right on the edge of coming off and get it out of play so that the thermal expansion doesn't pop it off.
I've been considering the thermocouple old when it starts to spit the black stuff, and so that might not necessarily be the case.
The real trick is using those witness cones as you suggest, and maybe once every 5 or 10 firings, throw a witness cone out on the shelf that's right below the thermocouple, a couple inches away from it, and just use that as your standard, an Orton self-supporting cone, and just check up on the thermocouple every now and then. Even if you just once every 20 or 30 firings, it'd be better than never at all. And then what people will do is take that witness cone and put it on a shelf, just kind of left to right. They'll start stacking them up. And over time, you'll see the cone bending more and more and more. And that tells you that the thermocouple is kind of decalibrating and drifting toward an overfire. And that would be the time to change the thermocouple. But I wanted to go back to a point, people say, well, wait a minute, relays and thermocouples, if those are like tires and oil changes, is there a way that I can avoid that? And there is, people will say, Jim, can't you build a kiln that doesn't have relays that stick or fail and thermocouples that don't drift? And the answer is always, of course we can. It's just more money. And so you have a choice between a $20 thermocouple that drifts and flakes a little bit, or a $350 thermocouple that's good for the lifetime and then some of that kiln. And it's pretty fragile. So if you hit it and it breaks, do you want to spend another $350? Yeah. So most people elect to buy a handful of the 20 use a toothbrush and some index cards. Same is true with relays. We do now make virtually every kiln with what are called solid state relays. Instead of clicking all the time, it's a solid state material. It's real quiet and real durable, but it's significantly more money to outfit a kiln with solid state relays than the simple electromechanical relays that we use. There is a way to do it. Christine, yours should come with solid state relays on it. So you're
that's exciting.
That's exciting. And I will also warn anyone, if they hit it, then I will cry. So I will make sure that we keep everything all. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, Christine, you'll have to do a little video tour of your new kiln once you get it in for us.
I'm so excited. I even got the landlord was super nice about, he did the electricity for me. I'm super excited.
Oh, that's great.
Yes. Yeah, my kiln's birthday is coming up next week. We celebrate it every year. I get a little cupcake.
Love
because that girl does the work for me. She's keeping me in business. So
your best employee.
Exactly.
Giving me a marketing idea.
There you go. Hey, let's talk. Yeah. I'm in. Can we talk about loading best practices, like things we need to keep in mind when we're loading the kiln? Can we sit items up on the top of the brick while we're loading, or is that maybe a bad idea? Things like that.
Yeah, you could probably set something on the brick, like the edge of the.
The edge of the kiln.
Yeah, like anything, if you set it down gently, it's fine. If you set it down like it's a rock, you're going to out the brick. So, with caution, I think that's okay. Probably the most important thing for people to take away on loading the kiln is it's actually really critical. And you guys control a lot of how the kiln fires by how you load it. And people don't always know that. Like when we build a kiln, we build it with what we call a standard load, which nobody fires this way, but we had to standardize on something. So we put in a layer of shelves, 1 inch off the floor, and then a 4-inch post, and then another layer of shelves, and then a 4-inch post, and another layer of shelves. And then we design the elements so they'll fire that load uniformly. Put some mass on the shelves to simulate the pots that you guys would have out there. But who fires a kiln loaded like that? When you do, our kiln will fire pretty uniformly. But let's imagine you took the bottom half of the kiln and you filled it full of river rocks. And let's imagine the top of the kiln was loaded up with cotton balls. Okay, pumice stone, something that it won't burn up, but it's very, very lightweight. And then you hit it with this uniform heat from us, and what's going to happen? Well, the top stuff is going to get baked really, really hot. The bottom stuff is going to be really, really cold, all because of the mass, right? There's so much mass in the bottom and so little mass in the top, but we're firing it or sending heat to it like it's all uniform. The biggest trick that you can do to ensure high quality, uniform temperature top to bottom is just distribute the mass evenly across that whole cylinder top to bottom. So it's kind of contrary, especially, when you're really busy going into Christmas or something. You stuff the bottom of the kiln really, really full, and you might leave 6 inches at the top of the kiln open. You misjudged how much stuff you could put in there. Well, the top 6 inches of that kiln are going to fire hot, and the bottom's going to fire colder than that, and there's just no two ways around it. If you were to unload the kiln and stack that mass more evenly top to bottom, you'd have a much better chance of the kiln firing uniformly. Does that make sense? Did I explain that?
It does. Yeah. You basically use the same amount of things to take up the full space instead of just leaving it empty at the top.
Exactly. And keep in mind, the shelves are probably the most dense thing you put into the kiln. We think of the pottery as the cool stuff, what we're focused on, but in terms of overall mass, it's a lot less than the kiln furniture, the kiln shelf.
I was always taught to load the kiln with platters at the bottom.
I was told in the middle.
Well, this was a long time ago.
I didn't know if that's
so. I don't think that's right.
Well, so a couple more things just to keep going on.
Yes.
Platters are an interesting case. The next best practice would be on each shelf to do what we call doming the load. Put the tallest stuff at the center of the shelf, and then ring that with medium height stuff. And then ring that outer ring should be the lowest height stuff. And by doing that, everything on that shelf is going to get some radiant heat from the elements. Line of sight radiation is the same heat transfer as the sun to your face on a sunny day. And if you put a piece of cardboard up, the shade keeps that radiant heat from hitting your face. Well, that's what happens if you were to imagine doing it the opposite way. Let's put a platter or a plate in the center of the shelf and then ring it with coffee mugs. You've just put the platter in the shade.
Sure.
Okay, so that's bad. And then you're stuck with conduction. Most, the convection and conduction heat transfer, and that's really slow and kind of inefficient. So we want everything in there to see line of sight radiation coming out of those heating elements. So a platter, whether it's at the bottom or the middle or the top, we want it to see, if at all possible, nice uniform radiation. And one trick that we've been able to encourage people to do, and with mixed success, I'm not going to say this is a panacea, but imagine this huge platter. If the rim is getting all the radiant heat, but the center part of the platter isn't, it goes through quartz inversion at a different time. And then because it's so big, the forces can actually add up and break the platter.
Sure.
So it's important that the whole platter go through that temperature inversion or expansion and contraction called quartz inversion, which is at about 1,058 degrees Fahrenheit. It's important to get that whole platter to go through it. And by tilting the platter, then you've got radiant heat hitting the bottom and the top of the center of the platter as well as the rims. Then the whole thing kind of goes through it at the same time. If you can tilt up a platter just even an inch or two on one side, that'll help get heat into the kind of underneath the platter. And then that center part of the platter will expand at the same time the rim or the edges do.
And how do you do that? Am I being dense about this? Like what, how do I tilt the platter with my stilts?
It's easy for me to just say. What people have done is if you can take some old fire brick. If you happen to have an old fire brick around, we have oodles of it. And if anybody wants a piece, let me know. But you could prop up a stilt on one end on some fire brick or just another post. Even if you took like a 1-inch post and
the tiny ones, and
kind of tilted it and just let it come in contact with the platter that way. It's a little bit of a juggling act. I get it. But if you start thinking creatively about how could I tilt it up just a little bit, let some radiant heat get underneath the platter. It can be
interesting.
And then
that's so
people
cool.
have said, I tilted it up like 4 inches and the glaze kind of pooled down at one end. It's probably overfired it a little bit. And that maybe is too much. So
too severe.
This goes with the big gap between theory and practice. And
sure.
Tilting it up would be helpful in practice. How are you going to do it? but I think
Yeah.
propping up stilts on one end of it is the right answer.
And we're saying platter here, which is just kind of like a universal term that I think we throw at like a lot of plates. Would you consider this to be something over like what, 10 inches, 12 inches?
Yeah, probably over 12 inches. I think that even 12-inch rounds seem to fire pretty uniformly. But once you get into that and the shape of it, that oval shape of a platter, oftentimes it just adds to the strength of the clay. So when you get some of it going through quartz inversion and some of it not, then you have enough of it that it's strong enough to break the clay. That's when it happens. So it won't happen on a little oval platter that's 3 inches across. It has to be, a pretty fair amount of clay to build up enough force to break itself. But that certainly is one of the toughest things to fire is a big platter, like a 24-inch platter, 26-inch platter in a 28-inch wide kiln. That's a tough one.
And another thing that I think some of us have learned the hard way is that it's not great to fire on the floor of your kiln. I don't know if that's the right term, but there should always be that shelf right underneath, about what, like an inch or two from the bottom.
Even a half inch if you really can't afford the space, but a half-inch post down there at the bottom before the first layer of shelves would be good. And yeah, the floor of the kiln tends to fire pretty cool. It starts out in the first part of the firing where there's no infrared heat transfer and it's all no radiant transfer. It's all convection. And that's where, below 1,000 degrees, that's where all the heat rises. So the bottom of the kiln can be 400 or 500 degrees colder than the top of the kiln, just coming right out of the block. So that floor can fire cold and always be trailing. And so by propping up a little bit, we allow for two things. One, a little bit of an insulation layer and a buffer there, but we also allow for fumes and that air exchange that a downdraft vent would require. It has to be able to get in underneath the shelf and have the hot air exit the kiln through the floor of the kiln. So I want to prop everything up just to get good airflow that way.
So are there any, like every year you should do these things to help your kiln last longer? Is there any, other than changing what we already talked about, is there anything else that you can say, like, these are good things that make your kiln age well?
We're real big on safety, right? We don't want any injuries or any problems there. And I always start my presentations with an image of the lid brace, the thing that holds the lid open, and reminding people to check the anchor pad, is what we call them, both the top and the bottom point on the kiln body and on the kiln lid where that brace is attached, and make sure that the screws aren't rusty and that everything's tight and secure, because that's the whole thing holding the lid up when you're loading and unloading the kiln. And we've had a few cases where that's faltered and people have had the kiln bonk them on the head. And it's after, 20 years of neglected maintenance, deferred maintenance, where stuff like that happens. So, it certainly didn't leave our factory that way. And people would just observe it maybe once a year and look at it. And that doesn't look right. You can avoid all of that. So it's extremely rare, but also I've been asking people to do that my whole career. Check those anchor points, because we want, repeat customers and return customers. If you're getting ready to move your kiln, you're going to unstack it and use those handles and whatnot to move the kiln. Just check for, if you buy salt water, sometimes those screws get rusty. We'll be happy to send you replacement screws, but don't start lifting the kiln if the attachment screws for the handles or things like that are rusted out. That's just kind of safety 101. And then I would say annually you should check the kiln plug where it goes into the wall outlet. In my classes, I'll tell people, make sure and push that plug in before every firing. But once a year, you should probably unplug it and take a look at it and make sure it's not corroded and oxidized and kind of nasty looking. And if it is, you probably need to change the plug and the wall receptacle at the same time. You don't want to change just the plug, because the wall receptacle will fry the plug. So those are things to look for. Vacuum your kiln out if there's a bunch of junk in there, especially, heaven forbid, asking for a friend. If you happen to have a wet load explode inside a kiln, or have a pot that maybe got fragments of bisque and glaze on the elements, you'd want to stop that firing if you happen to hear the explosion. It's usually kind of a dull thudding sound when it goes. Stop and vacuum the kiln out, because that glaze is the one thing that can break an element. It's really glass. Glaze is just a glass, and it forms, eutectic is the technical term for it, but it'll eat through the metal. The glass will kind of eat through the metal of the heating element, and then that renders that element broken, useless. We don't want that. And so if you happen to have junk sitting on top of your elements, get that off of there right away if you notice it's got glaze on it. And then even just annually, a little bit of brick dust might build up, and we want to keep those elements free of any debris so that they can radiate their heat really efficiently. Other than that, again, on the safety side, very rarely does this happen, but let's say somebody kind of drops the lid down, and it might crack the lid all the way through so that you can see a crack on both the hot and the cold face that mirrors itself, right? So you can see a big S crack or something like that. If that were the case on the lid, we'd probably want to replace that lid because we don't want the lid to, I've never heard of it happening, but if you lost compression on the band, then the lid could collapse in. Again, never had it happen, but I can imagine a world where it could happen, and we wouldn't want that. So look for big cracks in the outside of your lid.
That's all of those are great tips. Could you speak to some of our studio owners who maybe their employee accidentally fired a Cone 06 kiln to a Cone 6 kiln? Is there something that they need to do other than like maybe take a second and cry a little bit? But is there anything like maintenance wise at that point that you need to do other than maybe like vacuum and check that there's nothing on your elements?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on how the load has deformed. It just kind of comes straight down. A lot of times, a flop of stuff at the bottom of the kiln. If it hasn't hit the sidewalls, you might just think about buying a new slab and unstacking the kiln and putting it on a new slab, and you're good to go. Lesson learned. But if it's gotten into the sidewalls, it can be pretty tricky. You might have to do some brick replacement and element replacement there. So it depends a little bit on what has been damaged and how much goop got melted and where it's stuck to. But a couple of other things to try to prevent that from happening, just psychologically or mentally, if you think of the O as a minus sign, then the whole temperature scale makes sense, right? -6 would be colder than 6. And I don't know why they didn't use minus signs instead. They just used these.
Right.
But it's one trick for training your staff. Like just think of that O as a minus sign, and then 06 is different than 6. And especially now that people are doing stoneware and they're doing both, they got to really understand that's a 400-degree difference. But the kilns basically can handle the 400-degree increase. It's just the wear inside that can't.
I will say it is harder to make that mistake with the touch screen. Like now I'm just pitching for the touch screen. I think everyone should have one. It is much harder. But in years past, right. Yeah. You see it all on the screen. In years past, when we didn't have the touch screen, we would just hang a sign on the kiln, like a ceramic sign that's like, stop. This kiln was used to fire glass. You need to check everything before you get the next thing in. And it was very handy, but yeah, it can be devastating. Have you seen a melted kiln before, Christine?
Yeah, I was just going to say what we did with the touchscreen is that we created a program, and it's called This One in caps because it happened once and that's all we needed. So that is when I teach people to do the kiln, that's what I show them is hit this one. There's no questions. It's this one. I love it. It's so those touchscreens are amazing. Yeah. This one, nothing else on there. Just, So I appreciate that. That was really helpful for teaching new staff.
Yeah. Back in the day, this feature came out of you all, feedback from CCSA people that asked if we could put in a max programmable temperature. So not what the kiln's capable of doing, but can you just set it at 2000 degrees so when we try to program Cone 6, it just beeps and it doesn't go there? And that feature is available in all of our controllers. So that's something, if you are just doing Cone 06 or glass work, you could kind of limit that max programmable temperature. So
is that what the alarm is? Like because it used to say like alarm 999, and I always wondered what that was.
Yeah, so the alarm is just in there for people that might want to be alerted. If you don't have a downdraft vent, maybe set the alarm for 1000 degrees. So when it hits 1000, to go over and lower the lid down.
I see.
Or people that want to be there just to make sure the kiln has shut off correctly, set the alarm just a few degrees before shut off temperature. It starts beeping and it draws your attention to the kiln. You go look at it, make sure that it went to complete and it's cooling down, things like that. And then we set it to 9999, basically disable it. So it's hopefully never going to get that hot. Be the surface of the sun. So we don't. Yeah, so this is in addition to, so the alarm isn't really like a cutoff or anything there. It's just an audible, but you could set that max programmable temperature if you were just fine.
So if there's a brand new baby studio owner that's listening to the podcast, join the CCSA, listening to all these things about how the best practice with the kiln, what do you recommend for them to not be afraid to hit that start button?
Whether it's a brand new kiln or a new set of elements, it's always important to do a test firing. And for a couple of reasons, we want to put that protective aluminum oxide coating on the outside of the elements. And the only way we can do that is to fire it up and hold it there for a while. So we always recommend at least a cone 04 for your first firing, and you fire it empty. So if you just program that and hit start, there's nothing in it to melt. There's no, you can put a cone on a shelf and just kind of get a feel for it. That's probably the best practice, right out of the blocks. But also, take a look at the videos. There's a zillion of them. And if you're really freaked out about it, call our tech support. We've got 5 full-time technicians, 4 full-time, 1 part-time, and they're fantastic. And this is what they live for. So give them a call. There's no reason to be stressing out. I think it's natural, but it's not necessary. If they've never done it, to be concerned about it. And we appreciate that. It is getting hot, and it's an electrical appliance with a big load. So it's important to be careful, but don't let it paralyze you. And it's pretty fun should be fun, not scary. So give us a call if you're getting sweaty palms.
That's good advice.
That's great. And I think some of that sweaty palms comes from maybe like just safety concerns. Are there anything, like any way to minimize these safety concerns? Like you've mentioned checking the screws, you've mentioned ventilation and things like that. Is there really anything else that we can be doing to make sure we're being safe?
Let me address kind of the larger picture, right? Like fire marshals oftentimes are, if they're not familiar with kilns, they will default in a school setting to you can't fire it. When we work with them and explain how the kilns work, we can always get them back to a point where they say, oh, that seems pretty safe. But the two main things, and just kind of whether it's in a contemporary studio setting or not, kilns get hot, so they need a fair amount of air around them. So never put them in a really confined space. If you had to put them in a small space, that space has to be monitored, engineered, designed to be able to take these things. Put off 1227 at max temperature puts off the same amount of heat as 6 space heaters.
Wow.
That's just at 2350, and just at that kind of, if you were to hold it there for a long time, which nobody does, but that's the worst case kind of steady state heat flow coming out of our kilns. Now imagine putting that into a closet.
Right.
That's just way too much. So people don't do smart things, have problems, and It's very rare, but don't put it in a confined space, and make sure that the electrical connection to your building is solid. Making sure that the plug is plugged into the wall before every firing, and checking it every now and then to make sure it's not corroded. Corrosion is resistance, and resistance causes heat. We don't want heat in the wall receptacle. And this goes for toasters and coffee makers too, and hair dryers.
Sure.
I'm fanatical about plugging everything firmly into the wall. And when you get a wall plug for your coffee maker, stop, change the outlet. Don't keep using your coffee maker in a wobbly don't just pinch the prongs together and shove it in there.
Oh, Lord.
so those are the two, in the broadest sense, those are the two things that, you've got a thing that creates a lot of heat, and it uses electricity to do that. So we want to make sure the electrical connection is solid and that the heat can be dissipated in the room in a smart way. Once you understand the basics, like I said, even the most conservative fire marshals, we can usually get them to the point where they say, yeah, that's okay. Now that I understand it, we're good. Yeah. We make zillions of these, thousands and thousands of these things every year, and they go all over the world. If there were a problem, I'd have gray hair right now.
And for everyone who can't see, as luscious, not gray hair.
But we get a chance these things are really pretty safe. And I get a chance to sleep at night because, there's just so few problems with the kiln if they're installed properly.
How far should your kiln be away from the wall, and what's the radius we need to keep of stuff not?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So right on that serial plate, the label has our serial number on the side of the red box, it'll say 18 inches of clearance to non-combustible surfaces. Okay, now a non-combustible surface is technically at least 2 thicknesses of sheetrock. So if you just have a sheetrock building and you're going to put your kiln over in the corner, to turn it into a non-combustible corner, just add another layer of sheetrock in the corner on each side, and you'll be set. Same is true for the floor. It needs to be on a non-combustible floor. So don't put it on a wood floor without doing something underneath it. Now you can add materials, building materials like patio pavers underneath the kiln. I've seen lots of people put in little 2-inch thick pavers that extend about 6 inches past the diameter of the kiln. And then that trick of putting in sheetrock, or if it's just a framed building, just raw studs, you could put that concrete sheetrock called, I think one of the name brands is Wonderboard, but it looks like a piece of sheetrock, but it's made out of concrete. And so you could hang that in there, and those are non-combustible. You only need 1 thickness of that. And then we like to see at least 8 feet from floor to ceiling. Again, if you're going to put it in something that's got a lower ceiling, think about the heat up on the ceiling. Probably need to make that non-combustible as well, or figure out how to ventilate that. And then a special case might be something to just watch out for, be aware of. It happens a lot in schools and maybe in commercial spaces where a fire sprinkler is located right over the kiln. On occasion, those can be set off.
Yeah.
That looks bad on our resume. But usually, again, working with, if there has to be a fire sprinkler right there because the fire marshal said so, they're usually pretty good with putting in a high temperature sprinkler head. So normally they're rated for, I think, 150 degrees. And you can usually get one that goes up to like 250. And that
I had no idea.
Solves the problem if it's an 8-foot ceiling. Once we get into that realm, I would say if you have those issues, make sure and call our tech support people. This podcast alone is probably for making sure that you don't have a problem. We'd want to dot the I's and cross the T's, but that's generally the thing to look for.
I've heard you do this talk before, something similar, and I'm walking away from this conversation with so much more information. And I can't wait to go tell my kiln tech, which is my girlfriend. I can't wait to tell her everything I learned and also make her listen to this episode. So yeah, thank you so much, Jim. Christine, are there any kind of last questions while we got the man of the hour here?
I don't think so. I agree with you that I think that any studio owner that has somebody that is doing some kind of kiln firing, you need, like, let them listen to this too. Like that's, I have never heard you talk about this kind of stuff. So I am overwhelmed with all the things that I need to share with my staff, and I can't wait to hear you again so I learn more. So thank you so much for your brain.
Oh my gosh, you guys ask great questions. So I think that's...
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed the show, everyone. Give your customers incentive to return often by bringing in fresh new shapes. View Bisque Import's latest and greatest shapes on our website and hit the Notify Me button to be first in line to order when they arrive. If you've got ideas for new shapes, feel free to send them in to marketing@bisqueimports.com.
Feel like a juggler at your ceramic studio? Between classes, bookings, and admin tasks, those pins keep flying. Let Occasion help you put down the act and get back to creating. Visit occasion.act to discover your peace of mind.
Are you ready to be inspired and take your studio to new heights? As a CCSA member, you'll have exclusive access to our annual convention, the must-attend event for Fired Art Studio owners. With expert speakers, hands-on workshops, and networking opportunities, the convention is where you'll learn the latest industry trends and gain insight to grow your business. Plus, you'll connect with suppliers showcasing the newest products. Don't miss out on the most exciting event of the year. Become a CCSA member today at ccsaonline.com and join us for the next convention.
Can you let the audience know how to get a hold of tech support and anything that they need? Is it just through the website? Is there a special number?
Yeah, if you hit the contact us at skutt.com, skutt.com, contact us, but our phone numbers is the same, hasn't changed forever, 503-774-6000. So that will date the podcast in any way, shape, or form. And and you might have to sit on hold for, I think our average hold time's 2.5, 3 minutes, something like that. But they're taking their time with everybody, and
exactly.
They'll take their time with you too when you call. So
yeah, definitely worth it. So
and a phone call right now, phone calls probably are still our best way of doing it, rather than, we've looked at chat bots and we've looked at email. It's just hard to cut through the chase. We're going to have so many questions, and by the time you get us answers, the email thread gets crazy. So
and it's so specific, right? It's not like a one answer for everything kind of thing. It just depends on what's happening.
Yeah. So give us a ring, and we'll take good care of you.
Well, wow. Thank you so much. And everyone listening at home, I hope that you also feel very inspired and less intimidated by your kiln, and that you also start celebrating its birthday.
Yes. Yes.
All right, thanks so much for having me on the show.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah.
See you in the next one. Bye.
Bye.
Glazed Over is brought to you by the CCSA, the Contemporary Ceramic Studios Association. Thank you to our moderators, Amy Williams and Christine Steele. Intro and outro music by Scott Lester. Executive production by Louise Blazucki. Learn more about the CCSA at ccsaonline.com.